On a late summer afternoon in 1867, the small market town of Alton in rural Hampshire appeared to be a typical corner of Victorian England, orderly, industrious, and largely untouched by serious crime. Within this seemingly secure setting, 8-year-old Fanny Adams would soon become the central figure in one of the most notorious child murder cases of the 19th century. Alton was a modest community of tradesmen, labourers, and small shopkeepers, ringed by meadows and hop gardens and linked to the wider world by road and rail, rather than by any substantial industry of its own. Residents and local newspapers alike later remarked that no one could recall a murder in living memory. Children were accustomed to playing in the open fields around Flood Meadow, and parents allowed them a degree of freedom that reflected confidence in the town's quiet reputation. Victorian law and order in such places rested on a relatively small constabulary, a coroner's inquest system for sudden deaths, and the authority of assize courts sitting periodically to try serious offences. At the same time, the national press and illustrated papers were developing a growing appetite for sensational trials, especially those involving violence against women and children. When a crime appeared to violate not only the law but also widely held ideals of domestic innocence and childhood, it could quickly attract attention far beyond its immediate locality. It was into this framework of a quiet provincial town, a legal system prepared to respond to sudden violence, and a press ready to report it in detail, that the disappearance of a single child from a familiar meadow in August 1867 would intrude, drawing the life of Fanny Adams and her family under an intense and unwelcome scrutiny that they could not have anticipated. Fanny Adams was born on the 30th of April 1859, the daughter of George and Harriet Adams, and grew up in Tanhouse Lane on the northern side of Alton. The 1861 census shows her living with her parents and several siblings in a cluster of modest cottages where relatives, including her grandparents George and Anne Adams, lived immediately next door. In later descriptions, she was called a tall, comely and intelligent girl who appeared older than her 8 years and was known locally for a lively, cheerful disposition. Her closest companion was her neighbour and friend of the same age, Minnie Warner. Together with her younger sister Lizzie, they formed a familiar trio in the lanes and meadows around their homes. The family's circumstances were typical of working-class households in a small market town. George Adams earned his living as a labourer on nearby farms. Harriet managed the home and children. Flood Meadow and the adjoining hop gardens lay only a short distance from Tanhouse Lane, separated from the houses by little more than footpaths and the River Way. Because serious crime was virtually unknown in the district, parents generally regarded these open spaces as safe for children's games, especially on fine summer days when there was farm work to finish and household tasks to complete. Frederick, often recorded as Frederick George Baker by contrast, was an outsider to Alton. Aged 29 in 1867, he worked as a solicitor's clerk in the office of Mr. Clements on Alton High Street, opposite the Swan Hotel. Sources indicate that he had come from Guildford, Surrey, where his father was a master tailor, and had been in Alton for about 12 months before the events of August 1867. As a clerk in a law office, wearing a frock coat, waistcoat and tall hat, he occupied a lower middle-class position that carried an air of respectability and education in the eyes of many townspeople. Some later accounts refer to Baker as peculiar and note a family history of mental illness, but the extent to which such concerns were evident to ordinary residents of Alton before the crime is unclear. Contemporary reports suggest that local children recognized him from church and previous encounters, and that adults were prepared to accept his presence as unremarkable. For Fanny, her sister, and their friend, he would have been a familiar figure rather than a stranger. These two lives, a working man's daughter who roamed the fields near her home in company with other children, and a young law clerk lodging in the town centre, intersected most visibly in everyday settings: the church, the high street, and the footpaths leading toward Flood Meadow. It was on one such ordinary Saturday afternoon, when the girls sought permission to play as usual in the fields beyond Tannhouse Lane, that the sequence of events culminating in Fanny's death began. On Saturday, 24th of August 1867, the weather in Alton was fine and warm. Shortly after midday, 8-year-old Fanny Adams, her younger sister Lizzie, and their friend Minnie Warner asked Fanny's mother Harriet for permission to go out and play. Harriet agreed, and the three girls left the cottages in Tannhouse Lane and walked toward Flood Meadow and the nearby hop gardens. Open ground they knew well and had used many times as a playground. Sometime early in the afternoon, the girls encountered Frederick Baker walking along the path. He was dressed, as usual, in a dark frock coat, light waistcoat and trousers, the attire of a respectable solicitor's clerk. According to later testimony, he spoke to the children and produced coins, offering them halfpennies to buy sweets and picking blackberries for them as they walked. This combination of apparent generosity and casual conversation did not alarm the girls. They recognized him from church and the town centre, and there was nothing in his outward manner to indicate danger. At a certain point, Lizzie and Minnie decided to turn back toward home. Baker, however, suggested that Fanny accompany him further, toward the village of Sheldon. Accounts agree that he took her up in his arms and carried her through a gate into a hop garden, while the other two girls remained behind. Before leaving, he is reported to have told Lizzie that he would bring Fanny home later and that she could have another halfpenny if she kept quiet about the encounter. Lizzie and Minnie then returned to Tannhouse Lane, where Lizzie repeated to her mother what Baker had said. Harriet, apparently not yet alarmed, expected her eldest daughter to follow soon. As the afternoon wore on and Fanny did not return, concern grew. Harriet went out to look for her, questioning Lizzie and Minnie again about where they had last seen her and who had been with her. The girls pointed toward Flood Meadow and the hop garden, repeating their account of Baker's presence and his promise to bring Fanny home. By early evening, Fanny's father, George Adams, and other local men were searching the surrounding fields and paths. They found no sign of the child, but several people recalled later seeing Baker in the vicinity during the afternoon, moving between the meadow and the town. Around 5 o'clock, Baker returned to his office in High Street. His employer later testified that he appeared somewhat the worse for drink, but was able to resume his clerical work. That evening, he visited the local beer house, where he was seen with minor injuries on his hands and clothing that witnesses described as bearing spots of what might be blood or mud. At this stage, however, there was still no confirmed knowledge of Fanny's fate, only a deepening anxiety in her family and among neighbours as darkness approached and searches of the usual play areas yielded nothing. It was not until later that day and into the following hours that the first fragments of evidence, scattered in and around the hop garden to which Baker had taken Fanny, began to emerge. What had started as an ordinary summer outing for 3 small girls was, by that point, rapidly turning into a missing child case with a named adult last seen in her company. The full extent of what had happened to Fanny would only become clear as searchers returned to the meadow and the authorities were called to the scene, as described in the next part of this account. When Fanny failed to return by early evening, neighbours widened their search beyond the usual footpaths. Between 7 and 8 o'clock, a labourer, Thomas Gates, a Crimean War veteran, entered the hop garden to tend his crops and made the first dreadful discovery. He found Fanny's severed head placed on 2 hop poles. A wider search of the surrounding ground revealed that her body had been extensively mutilated and dismembered, with limbs and internal organs scattered around the field and into the nearby River Wey. Some parts, including the breastbone, were never recovered. News was carried back to Tannhouse Lane, where Fanny's mother collapsed from shock. Her father, on being told, seized a loaded shotgun and had to be restrained by neighbours from going in search of the killer himself. The scene in the hop garden quickly drew a crowd. Hundreds of townspeople arrived on the Sunday and Monday to assist in collecting Fanny's remains and clothing. While their efforts helped recover most of the scattered body parts and garments, the number of feet on the ground almost certainly destroyed footprints and other delicate trace evidence that might have helped identify the murder weapon or the exact sequence of events. Police Superintendent William Cheney of Hampshire Constabulary was called to the meadow that evening. The landlord of the nearby Leathern Bottle public house handed him a bundle labelled "Portions of a Child," gathered by locals. Cheney began to coordinate the search more systematically, organising officers and townspeople to look for the missing body parts and any object that might have been used as a weapon. A large stone bearing hair, blood, and a small piece of flesh was found and seized as a potential instrument of blunt force injury. Fanny's remains were taken to a doctor's surgery in Amery Street, where the body was reassembled as far as possible for post-mortem examination before being transferred to the local police station. Attention turned quickly to the last adult known to have been in Fanny's company. From the statements of Lizzie Adams and Minnie Warner, and from Mrs. Gardner and Mrs. Warner, Cheney learned that a solicitor's clerk named Frederick Baker had been seen giving the girls money and leading Fanny toward the hop garden earlier that afternoon. Tracing Baker to his employer's office on High Street at about 9 o'clock that night, Cheney found him still at work, an hour later than usual. Baker denied any involvement, but was arrested on suspicion of murder. A hostile crowd had gathered outside the building. To prevent a lynching, police escorted him out by the back door. At the station, Baker was searched. 2 small pocket knives, unstained to the naked eye, were found on his person. There were spots of blood on his shirt cuffs, and his trousers appeared to have been recently washed, as if an attempt had been made to dilute or conceal stains. When asked to explain the blood, Baker replied that he had no cuts on his hands to account for it. His demeanour was described as cool and collected, despite being informed that he was suspected of a particularly brutal child murder. Shortly afterwards, Superintendent Cheney returned to Baker's desk at the solicitor's office and discovered a diary among his legal papers. The entry for Saturday, 24th of August 1867 read, "Killed a young girl. It was fine and hot." Baker admitted writing the words, later claiming they were nonsense penned while drunk. The investigation continued into the autumn. A local boy came forward to say he had seen Baker emerging from the hop garden around 2 p.m. on the day of the murder, his hands and clothes saturated with blood, before bending to wash at the river and putting a small knife and another object into his pocket. His mother, to whom he had originally told the story, only reported it weeks later after mentioning it in a public house. Hampshire Constabulary also sent Fanny's clothing and Baker's knives to Dr. A.S. Taylor, a London forensic specialist at Guy's Hospital, for examination. Taylor concluded that the pattern of injuries suggested a larger or stronger instrument than the 2 pocket knives, and that the dismemberment could have been carried out in less than an hour while the body was still warm. The precise weapon was never found, but Taylor's opinion did not undermine the core allegation that whoever wielded it had done so with sustained, deliberate violence. By October 1867, the investigative file contained a consistent set of elements. Fanny last seen being carried by Baker into the hop garden, his presence near the scene at the relevant time, blood on his clothing without an adequate explanation, a diary entry apparently acknowledging the killing, and later testimony placing him in the act of washing himself at the river. No alternative suspect of comparable evidential weight emerged. On that circumstantial but substantial basis, Baker was committed for trial at the Winchester Assizes. Under English law at the time, a sudden violent death required an inquest before any full criminal trial. In Fanny Adams's case, Deputy County Coroner Robert Harfield opened proceedings at the Duke's Head Inn in Alton on the 27th of August 1867, only days after the murder. There, before a local jury, the first formal testimony was taken from those who had last seen Fanny alive and those who had discovered her remains. The inquest jury, having heard from the children and from police, concluded that she had been willfully murdered and that there was sufficient evidence to commit Frederick Baker for trial at the Winchester Assizes. The assize trial opened at Winchester on the 5th of December 1867 before Mr. Justice Mellor. Baker, charged with willful murder, was represented by counsel. The Crown presented a case built on eyewitness identification, physical evidence, and Baker's own writings. Minnie Warner testified that a man in a frock coat, light trousers and a tall hat had given the girls money and taken Fanny into the hop garden, and although she struggled with formal identification, she correctly described what Baker had been wearing that day. Fanny's mother, Harriet, and neighbour, Mrs. Gardner, recounted their encounters with Baker near the garden gate that afternoon, and his casual manner when questioned about the missing child, and his reasons for giving money to the girls. Superintendent Cheney described the arrest and the discovery at Baker's office desk of the diary entry for 24th August. Killed a young girl. It was fine and hot. The prosecution invited the jury to treat this as a contemporaneous acknowledgement of the crime, written in Baker's own hand. Medical and forensic testimony detailed the extent of Fanny's injuries and confirmed that the dismemberment had been carried out quickly while the body was still warm. Although Dr. A.S. Taylor of Guy's Hospital opined that a larger instrument than the 2 pocket knives found on Baker would have been needed to sever the limbs, he did not exclude Baker as the assailant. Rather, he suggested that an additional unidentified weapon had been used. The defense challenged the reliability of identification by a frightened child and argued that the unstained knives undermined the Crown's theory that they were the murder weapons. Counsel also advanced a plea of insanity or diminished responsibility, presenting evidence that Baker's father had been violent, that a cousin had been confined in asylums, that a sister had died of brain fever, and that Baker himself had once attempted suicide following a failed love affair. They suggested that the diary entry was written in a mechanical, habitual style, and that the absence of punctuation might alter its meaning. In his summing up, Justice Mellor reviewed the legal test for insanity and invited the jury to consider whether Baker was incapable of understanding the nature and quality of his act or of knowing that it was wrong. At the same time, he directed their attention to Baker's calm behaviour after the crime, his continued work at the office, his visit to the beer house, and his coherent diary entry, all of which the Crown argued were inconsistent with legal insanity. After only about 15 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty, rejecting the insanity defense. On the 24th of December 1867, Christmas Eve, Baker was hanged outside Winchester Prison before a crowd estimated at around 5,000 people. In a final letter to the Adams family read in court after his death, he expressed sorrow for what he had done in an unguarded hour and asked their forgiveness, a statement the authorities treated as a post hoc confession. His execution was the last public hanging at Winchester Jail, marking both the legal end of the case and the beginning of its long afterlife in public memory. With Baker's execution on 24th of December 1867, the formal judicial process concluded, but the case did not recede quietly. Fanny Adams was buried in Alton Cemetery. Her headstone, erected by voluntary subscription from local residents, testified to the depth of feeling in the town and the wish to memorialize her as an innocent child rather than as a mere subject of sensational headlines. For many years, visitors came to see the grave and the hop garden, treating them as somber landmarks in a crime that had shocked Victorian sensibilities. Nationally, newspapers and journals had already framed the murder as one of the most frightful of our time, emphasizing both its brutality and the apparent random vulnerability of a child playing near her home. there was little significant legal controversy over the verdict itself. Contemporary reports do not record organized campaigns for clemency, and later scholarship has generally treated Baker's conviction as supported by the available evidence, even while acknowledging gaps such as the missing principal weapon and the limited forensic techniques of the day. The most enduring aftermath lay in language and popular culture. In 1869, when tins of preserved mutton were issued as rations to Royal Navy sailors, they derisively referred to the contents as Fanny Adams, likening the dubious meat to the butchered remains of the murdered girl. Over time, Fanny Adams, and then Sweet Fanny Adams, became naval slang for poor-quality canned meat, and by extension, for next to nothing or nothing at all, often shortened to Sweet F.A., as a euphemism for a coarser phrase. Thus, a specific child's death, recorded in police files and assize reports, also left a lasting, if grimly ironic, imprint on everyday English speech. More than a century and a half later, the murder of 8-year-old Fanny Adams remains stark in its essentials. A child lured from a familiar lane, a body mutilated in a nearby field, and a solicitor's clerk whose own diary contained the words, "Killed a young girl. It was fine and hot." The investigation and trial led swiftly to conviction and execution, and unlike many historical cases, they left relatively little formal doubt in legal or scholarly records. Yet the story raises broader questions that reach beyond one verdict. What does it reveal about how Victorian society understood danger, respectability, and madness, and about the way a single local crime could be transformed into a lasting expression in everyday language? And looking back from the present, how should we remember Fanny Adams herself, as a footnote behind a grim idiom, or as a child whose short life deserves to be recalled separately from the phrase it inspired?